Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome again to Convention of States, Indiana Live. The purpose of our broadcast is to reach out to the Hoosier grassroots, to people and beyond Indiana, but mainly to the grassroots here in Indiana to introduce Convention of States to those individuals that are not involved in our movement, as well as individuals that are currently in the movement and just want to learn more about Convention of States. So let me bring myself up here on the screen so you can see me. And there I am. Our broadcast is in two segments. The first segment of the broadcast will be where we will discuss the basics of Convention of States. And these are basic tenets that we all in this movement learn and go by in the movement. By the way, my name's Dale Parrish. I forgot to mention that. I'm the state director for Convention of States here in Indiana. So, as I said, the first half of our broadcast this evening, we'll have a brief discussion on the basics of Convention of States. And then the second half of our broadcast tonight, we're going to have a discussion on repealing the 17th Amendment. And this is always a very interesting topic. And I'm going to have our legislative liaison and vice state director, Paul Phillips, joining us for that discussion. So more on that a little later. Now, in the meantime, I want to go ahead and bring up my PowerPoint so that we can get ready for this first segment of the broadcast this evening. So let me get the right selection here, and that should bring up, then you should be able to see that very well. So once again, thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll be getting into the basics here very shortly. First of all, I do want to tell you that in the event that this broadcast would abruptly end, please don't stay on. Don't stay on, because we won't be coming back on. If it abruptly ends, that means we've encountered a technical problem, and but we'll be back on next Monday, April 22nd. So when this happens, and it's happened a couple times in the past, when this happens, everything shuts down, and it just takes too long to bring everything back up again. So I don't want you to hang on thinking that we're going to come back on. So like I said, if all of a sudden the screen goes blank on you, that means we've encountered a technical problem, and we'll be back with you again next Monday evening. All right, let's now get started on some basic information here. I want to first go over the resources that we have available to us here in Indiana and nationally. The first item is our national website, which is conventionofstates.com. And you'll hear us make reference to this website frequently. We use it a lot. It has a wealth of information. If you're brand new to Convention of States, this is the first step you should take is to go to this website, conventionofstates.com, open an account, and sign our petition. So that'll get you started. So conventionofstates.com. Now, embedded in that national website is our state website page, and that will be conventionofstates.com/Indiana. So you'll want to take a look at that. That's a more focused page on the state of Indiana. Social media platforms. We're on Facebook. We have a Facebook page, Convention of States, Indiana. As a matter of fact, this broadcast tonight is coming to you through that Facebook page. We're on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel, COS Indiana. Now, the YouTube channel, the primary purpose of this is really for education. We have various narrated PowerPoints. We have recordings of these broadcasts that we do. And we also have a series of podcasts featured on there. Podcasts that our guest this evening, Paul Phillips, creates in his Free to Be Free podcast series. So all of his podcasts are on there, and you'll want to listen to as many of those as you can, or whichever ones are of interest to you. So go to our YouTube channel. Be sure to subscribe. Click on the subscribe button, and take a look and browse around our YouTube channel. Other social media platforms, we're on Twitter, hashtag COS Indiana. We're on Instagram, Convention of States Indiana, and we're going to be on LinkedIn very soon. We're in the process of getting a presence set up on LinkedIn also. So, a few numbers for you. In 2018, we surpassed 30,000 supporters here in the state of Indiana. We have been growing very, very rapidly here in the state. Been growing at about a 40% growth rate, which has been very, very good. And given that growth rate, we anticipate and we want to try in 2019 to hit 40,000 supporters here in our state. Of those supporters, about 2,900 are volunteers. These are individuals that have indicated a willingness to help out if needed. And in leadership, we have about 40 individuals in various leadership positions in our state. Now, this is very important. If you have any inclination, any desire to get involved, more involved in Convention of States, I would encourage you, and here's this website again, I would encourage you to go to conventionofstates.com, click on the menu selection, Take Action, scroll down, look at the different positions that we have available, volunteer positions. If anyone's of interest to you, open it up, read more about it. If you're really interested in it, then go ahead and make application. You're not obligated in any way, but what this does is that this gets your name on a report, and one of us then will be in contact with you to further discuss your interest in that particular position. So go to conventionofstates.com, take action, scroll down, and we would love to have your involvement in Convention of States here in Indiana. Okay, let's get started here. Our vision statement here in Indiana is we want to build a Hoosier grassroots community of citizens and legislators dedicated to the constitutional concept of self-governance. So everything we do here in the state of Indiana in Convention of States is directed toward someday achieving the vision that we have for this state. So let's get into the actual basics now. There are three tenets to the basics of Convention of States. Number one is a problem, number two, the solution, and number three is our plan to bring this about. So let's look at the problem. Basically, we think the problem is that our federal government is out of control and lacks the will and to address certain structural issues in our government, and lacks the will and the courage to address these issues. Now, we're not blaming any one particular political party. Both parties have contributed to this problem, and it has been going on for decades. This is not a current thing. It's been going on for decades. So let's look a little further into the problem. We've identified three abuses that we call abuses by the federal government that comprise this problem. And number one is our debt issue. Uh, National debt has surpassed $22 trillion, and nothing really is being done to resolve this issue. As you know, the forecast even call for the debt level to even increase more in the upcoming years. So now we're not going to get into any detail tonight, so we're just going to touch on these briefly. So number one's the debt issue. Number two is what we call the regulatory crisis. The administrative state, which has become the fourth branch of government. Yes, I know the current administration's been eliminating some regulations, but much more needs to be done. Not only regulating more regulations, but addressing the control needed over the individuals and the agencies that create these regulations. So that is the second abuse. And the third abuse has to do with state sovereignty. When our country was founded, it was founded on dual federalism, was the concept where the federal government and the state governments shared in power. Well, that has tilted all in favor of the federal government now. We think a lot of that has to do with career politicians. So we think that this should be addressed in the form of term limits, and we'll get into that a little bit more here a little later on. Okay, that's the problem and the abuses that we see going on. The solution, we think, is to conduct a convention of states for the purpose of amending the Constitution to address these abuses that we just covered. Now, Article 5 of our Constitution describes two methods of amending the Constitution. And let's look at those very briefly here. The first method is the way the amendments that exist now have been created, and that is where 2/3 of Congress propose an amendment or amendments, and those proposed amendments then go to the state legislatures to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, which would be 38 state legislatures. So that's the first method, and that's how amendments have been created so far. Well, there is a second method, and we're not making this up. This is right in Article 5, and that is where amendments are proposed at a convention of states that is then called by 2/3 of the state legislatures, which would be 34 states. Any amendment or amendments coming out of that convention of states would then have to go through the same ratification process as the first method, which would require 3/4 of the state legislatures, or 38 states, to ratify any amendment or amendments that come out of the convention. So that's what we're trying to accomplish. Okay, so what's our plan to bring this about? Our plan has two parts to it. The first part is what we call the application strategy. As we said, it takes 34 states to apply to hold this convention. All right, and we have literally devised and put forth the application form that we want 34 states to use. It's very important because all 34 applications have to be the same. That's called aggregation. So they have to be the same. So we've already created the form to be used. And that application, the subject matter of that application, which will determine the agenda at the convention, will address fiscal restraints. That's the national debt problem, limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. That addresses the regulatory crisis. And the third area is term limits. We think that will address the help address the state sovereignty issue, term limits for Congress and other federal officials. So that's the application strategy, to get 34 states making application using the same application format. The other part of our plan is mobilizing the grassroots. And when I say the grassroots, I'm talking about you and me and our state legislators, mobilizing the grassroots to bring this about. So we're making a great deal of headway. As I said, we need 34 states to make this happen. We now have 15 states that have made application and passed what it's also referred to as the resolution. Indiana is one of those states, so we are a passed state. So we have 15 states, and we need to get to 34. We're in all 50 states now. As I said, we're over 30,000 supporters here in Indiana, and over 3.8 million across the country. So we have a great deal of momentum going, and we would love to have more and more of our Hoosier citizens to become part of the Convention of States movement here in Indiana. All right, well, let me go back here to our broadcast, and I'm gonna send that PowerPoint out. And as I said, our second half of the broadcast, we're going to have a discussion on the 17th Amendment, and I'm going to bring in our guest this evening to join me in this discussion. There he is. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Dale. How are you tonight?
Good, good. Glad to have you, man. I want to point out that both Paul and I have created some material on this topic of the 17th Amendment, or repealing the 17th Amendment, and I created a narrated PowerPoint presentation, and Paul, in one of his podcasts, has created a podcast on this topic, and both of these items are on our YouTube channel. So we're gonna be briefly going through this topic tonight. So if you want more information, I would encourage you to go to the YouTube channel and take a look at both of those. Paul, what do you remember? What number is your podcast on the 17th Amendment?
It's easy to remember. It's episode 17.
Yeah, I might have known you would do that. Episode number 17. Okay, good. Okay, well, we're going to talk about this tonight, and I think let me see if I can get this going there. How you like that? The 17th Amendment sliding across there, Paul.
That's impressive.
Let's start, Paul. Let's start back from the beginning here, and let's start with the Articles of Confederation. So you want to get us going and
sure,
talk about the Articles of Confederation.
Yeah, all of this centers around how the states and the people are representative in the government. And under the Articles of Confederation is actually in Article 5 of the Articles of Confederation, a Congress was established to represent the states. Now, the people were not at all represented in the Confederation government, but each state could send anywhere from 2 to 7 members of Congress to be represented in the Federation Congress. But regardless of how many people they sent, it was one state, one vote. for their delegation. And as I said, nowhere were the people represented as they are in the House of Representatives today.
Okay. Okay. Well, and as we know, let's talk about then briefly what the framers had intended.
Sure.
And am I correct that the founders, the intent was to set up what is called as a bicameral legislature?
Absolutely. So that two houses.
Two houses. One would be the Senate, and one would be the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives would be the people's house, where the representatives were elected by the people and were there representing the people. But the Senate, the original intent was that the state legislatures would appoint these senators. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So in the House of Representatives, representing the people, the representation was in proportion to the population of each state. So each state gets a different number of representatives, and it's one vote per representative. In the Senate, the states would be represented. That's why we have 100 senators. Each state gets to send 2 senators.
Right.
And although it's not one state, one vote, really it's one state, 2 votes, but it is proportional that each state has an equal number of votes in the Senate.
Okay. And that two-house setup, or that dual structure of a Senate and the House, that was referred to as a bicameral legislature, right?
That's correct.
And I think most states have adopted the same setup, where we have an upper house and a lower house, except for one state.
Right.
And you know what state that is? I'm putting
Nebraska.
Nebraska. That's right. Nebraska is the only state that. How do they have? What do they call their?
They call them senators.
Huh?
They're senators.
They are all senators.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That's interesting. Very interesting. But of course, here in Indiana, we have both upper house and lower house. We have 50 senators, and we have 100 representatives. 100. Well, I should say 100 districts, and then of course 50 districts of our senators. So that was the intent of the framers, to create the upper house and lower house. Well, what happened? What happened to bring about the need for the 17th Amendment?
Okay, that I'll call that a trick question, because I don't think there was a need for the 17th Amendment.
Oh, right.
But so what the Senate did is it allowed the state governments to have a check on federal power, and it was a key part of federalism to keep a restraint on the federal government from growing too big. But the movement to create the 17th Amendment, to elect senators by popular vote rather than being appointed by the state legislatures, there were largely 3 arguments made for that in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And those were, number one, an argument that the state legislatures were corrupt, and a senator could get a position through a bribe. Although it was a popular belief, there really wasn't a lot of evidence. Pardon me. There wasn't a lot of evidence that was going on. A second argument for this was a deadlock or delay in electing senators. If you had a closely split state legislature, there could be a lot of disagreement. But if a state failed to appoint a senator or both senators, it was to their own detriment. So, I wouldn't feel sorry for a state legislature that was having trouble doing that.
So those states that had trouble, and I remember in the literature that there were states that this went on for years, where they were unable to appoint another senator. They lost the vote of that senator, right?
That's correct. But something that's little known is in 1866, the Congress passed some legislation requiring any senators appointed by the states to be elected by a majority vote. So they wouldn't allow a plurality vote. So if there were let's say 3 people in the running for a senator from a state, and one of them got 48% of the vote, got the most, normally we'd say, okay, he's the winner. That's what happens in popular election of senators. If you've got 3 candidates and one of them gets 48%, we're going to say, okay, they're the senator. But Congress had passed a law requiring a majority vote, which made it more difficult for the state legislatures to select senators. So this whole issue of deadlock and delay was really kind of self-inflicted by Congress. And once they went to popular vote, nowadays we don't care if a senator is elected by a plurality rather than a majority. And then the final reason given was simply populist sentiment. Populist and progressive movements wanted to expand the power of the federal government. And one important way to do that was to unleash the Senate, disconnect the Senate from the state governments.
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, in any event, the 17th Amendment was created and ratified in 1913.
Mm-hmm.
And it was early in Woodrow Wilson's first term, if I understand, if I remember correctly, right?
Right.
Okay. So the feeling is now there's a lot of people and that are in favor of trying or repealing this. So because this 17th Amendment basically did away with the states having any control, having any direct input into the federal government. So
correct.
Many feel that we need to repeal this amendment so that the states once again have that direct input into the federal government. Am I correct?
Right. So the senators no longer answer to the state governments for their actions. The state governments, when they appointed senators, could also recall them. So if the senators weren't voting the way the states wanted, they could replace them. What we have today are senators who answer to lobbyist interests because they need money to get reelected.
Right.
And I can give you a really quick example of where that has happened. When Obamacare passed, 27 states immediately filed in court to challenge Obamacare. So what that tells me is there was a majority of states that were opposed to that law. Now, had the 17th Amendment not passed, those 27 states could have simply told their senators, don't vote for the Obamacare law, and it would have never become law, rather than the only recourse for the states is to fight in the courts, which, as we've all experienced, is pretty messy, with now the law being a hodgepodge and
right.
Still to this day being challenged.
Right.
So there's a clear example of the impact of the 17th Amendment.
That's a good example. Well, of course, to sum this up, in convention of states, if we could hold a convention of states, it's possible then that we could repeal this amendment, 17th Amendment, correct?
Yeah, I believe that repealing the 17th Amendment would be germane or relevant to our application under the restricting the jurisdiction and power of the federal government, basically by reinstituting federalism and having the senators accountable to the state legislatures.
Right. Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay, Paul. Well, thank you very much for joining in this evening and discussing that topic. Again, I recommend that you go to our YouTube channel and take a look at Paul's podcast. It's number 17. Keep that in mind. And you might want to take a look at my narrated PowerPoint. We cover a lot of the same material in both of those items there on our YouTube channel. So I want to just recognize here some viewers that we have this evening. I don't know where you're all from, but Lynn Denny, I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. And Jerry Rowe, I know who that gentleman is. He's one of our leaders here in Indiana. June Nearing, I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. We enjoy having you with us, and I hope you'll come back again to join us. So, Paul, I'm going to close it out, and I want to thank you for participating tonight and
Sure.
giving us your input. As a matter of fact, Paul's going to be with me again on our next broadcast, which will be on April 22nd, and we're going to be talking about the Electoral College. And that's been a topic in the news here recently. And so Paul and I are going to hash out that topic on our next broadcast on April 22nd. So, Paul, I'm going to send you out, and thanks again for joining us tonight.
All right. Thank you, Dale.
All right. Well, I want to close out this evening. Once again, our next broadcast will be next Monday at on April 22nd, 7 p.m. We're going to be talking about the Electoral College. And I want to close out with the quote that I always like to bring up, and this is a quote from. Let me get that agenda item off of the screen there. But our president, Mark Meckler, has said this frequently, and I really think it's a good quote from him. And it's he basically says, he says, our country is faced with this fundamental question. And the question is not what should we do? The question is who will decide? And we think the people should be deciding these things or have much more say-so in making these decisions. And that's what we're all about in Convention of States. So if you're watching tonight and you are listening tonight, if you have any interest, please, we encourage you to go to our website, conventionofstates.com, and get involved. We really would love to have your involvement and your participation. Thank you. Have a good evening.